It began on an ordinary Friday morning, November 24, 2023, the day after Thanksgiving. The air in Warner Robins, Georgia, was cool and quiet, the kind of morning that seemed untouched by anything dark or tragic. On Wake Forest Drive, a peaceful suburban street lined with tall pines and holiday decorations still flickering from the night before, 63-year-old Lucille Ann McManus was supposed to be enjoying the simple calm of another day at home. But by 9:10 a.m., that calm would be shattered forever. A man's voice came through the Houston County 911 line. Steady, even polite. "I've just come back from walking the dog," he said, "and I found my wife dead." He claimed she had taken her own life. The caller was Brian McManus, 57 years old, Miss Ann's husband, a man who described himself as a former police officer from London, now living quietly in Georgia. But when officers arrived at 202 Wake Forest Drive, what they found wasn't a suicide. It was a crime scene drenched in horror, and a performance so convincing it nearly fooled everyone. Miss Ann lay lifeless across her bed. There was no gun, no shell casings, and no sign of self-inflicted harm. Instead, she had been beaten with terrifying force, her injuries so brutal that investigators immediately knew what this really was. This wasn't a tragedy of despair. It was murder, and the man who had just reported it, the calm, collected husband, would soon become the center of one of the most disturbing cases in Georgia's recent history. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Miss Ann. She was one of those rare people whose warmth made her impossible to forget. A friendly wave from the porch, a bright good morning to anyone passing by. At 63, she was the matriarch of a bustling family home, sharing her house with her granddaughter, Jessica Terrell, and 2 great-grandchildren. Her days were filled with noise, laughter, and the gentle rhythm of family life. After losing her husband years earlier, Miss Ann had learned to live with quiet loneliness. She missed companionship, the kind of comfort that comes not from passion, but from simply having someone to share mornings and evenings with. Friends said she longed for a partner to talk with over coffee, someone to walk beside her, someone who would make her feel cared for again. That wish would become the very thing that destroyed her. Because in 2022, Miss Ann, like millions of other people searching for connection, decided to try online dating. She downloaded Tinder, uploaded a few photos, and started swiping through profiles. Her family was happy for her, though cautious. She was, after all, kind to a fault. A woman who saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't there to be seen. It was on that app that she met Brian McManus, a charming British man with an air of sophistication and an impressive resume. He told her he had served for 17 years in the London Metropolitan Police, a career that supposedly gave him a sense of discipline, honor, and protection. He spoke with confidence, knew how to flatter, and carried himself with the authority of someone who had once worn a badge. To Miss Ann, he seemed like everything she had been waiting for. Kind, stable, and worldly. Someone who could give her companionship and perhaps a little excitement. But behind that polished accent and polite demeanor, Brian McManus was hiding a darkness no one could have imagined. He had, in truth, been dismissed from the Metropolitan Police after multiple women filed complaints of harassment and inappropriate behavior. His law enforcement career had ended in disgrace, but none of that appeared on Tinder. He presented himself as a respectable, lonely widower seeking love in a new country. And Miss Ann, ever trusting, saw in him not the danger he was, but the potential for happiness she so deeply wanted to believe in. Their connection was fast and intense. Within weeks, their conversations stretched late into the night. Brian said all the right things, the kind of words that feel like destiny when spoken to someone who's been lonely too long. He told her he wanted to build a life together, that he admired her warmth and her strength, that she made him feel at peace in a way he hadn't in years. By the time they met in person, the emotional groundwork had been perfectly laid. Miss Ann had fallen for him completely. What she didn't know was that this wasn't Brian's first time using romance as a means to an end. Years earlier, he had married another woman in Idaho, a relationship that ended in divorce after he was arrested for domestic violence. That pattern, charm, control, and destruction, was already deeply ingrained in him, but Miss Ann couldn't see the danger. She only saw the man standing in front of her, promising love and a future. In 2022, barely 3 months after their first date, Brian proposed. Friends were surprised by how quickly it happened, but Miss Ann's happiness drowned out any hesitation. She told her family it felt meant to be. Within months, they were married, and Brian moved into her home on Wake Forest Drive, joining the family she'd built across generations. To outsiders, it looked picture perfect, a mature couple who'd found love again, surrounded by children and grandchildren. But inside the house, the dynamic was already beginning to shift. Brian was different once he had what he wanted, less affectionate, more distant, sometimes cold. Jessica, Miss Ann's granddaughter, would later say that his presence brought an unease she couldn't quite name. He was polite, but detached. He didn't seem to enjoy family gatherings, and at times he acted like he didn't want to be there at all. And soon, it became clear why. Brian had a secret. Despite his polished image and his talk of a new life in America, he was still living the same double life that had destroyed his previous relationships. He began taking frequent business trips to Florida, trips that lasted days, sometimes weeks. When Miss Ann asked what kind of business he was doing, his answers were vague, evasive. He claimed he was pursuing investments, meeting potential business partners, exploring property deals. It sounded convincing enough, but in truth, Brian wasn't doing business in Florida. He was visiting another woman, a married woman. For months, he maintained the charade, shuttling between Miss Ann's home in Georgia and his mistress in Florida, juggling lies with the precision of a man who had practiced deceit his entire life. He was careful, methodical, and arrogant enough to think he'd never be caught. But arrogance breeds mistakes. In November 2023, Brian made one that would unravel everything. He accidentally sent a text message meant for his mistress to his wife. The message wasn't ambiguous. It was romantic, intimate, and clearly written for someone else. When Miss Ann read it, her heart broke. It was the kind of betrayal that makes the world tilt beneath your feet, when the person you trusted most becomes a stranger. But Miss Ann wasn't someone who kept quiet in the face of lies. She confronted him directly. According to investigators, that confrontation turned into an argument that shook the foundation of their marriage. Miss Ann was furious. She accused Brian of using her, of lying about who he was and what he wanted. And in her pain, she said something that terrified him. Not emotionally, but strategically. She told him she would report their marriage to immigration authorities as fraud. She told him she was done covering for him. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted completely. Because for Brian McManus, this wasn't just about being caught in an affair. This was about losing everything: his immigration status, his home, his future in the United States. If Miss Ann reported him, he would be deported back to the UK, where he was a disgraced ex-officer with nothing waiting for him. For a man like Brian, control was everything. Losing it wasn't an option. That was when he began to think about how to silence her. It's easy to imagine him pacing the house in the days that followed, calculating, rehearsing, preparing. To the outside world, everything seemed normal. He still walked the dog each morning. He still smiled at neighbors. He still spoke politely to Jessica and the children. But behind those calm eyes, something was changing. A coldness creeping in. Miss Ann, by contrast, was living in heartbreak. She had discovered the lies, and though she tried to keep her composure, those close to her noticed she was unusually quiet. Perhaps she sensed the danger. Perhaps she hoped he would just leave. But on that quiet Friday morning after Thanksgiving, Brian McManus made his choice. At 9:10 a.m., the call went through to dispatch. The voice on the other end, Brian's, was eerily composed. "I found my wife dead," he said again. "Looks like an obvious self-inflicted gunshot wound." When detectives arrived, they noticed his calmness immediately. Most people in shock struggle to speak. They cry, tremble, stutter. But Brian was steady. Too steady. Detectives Carmen Thompson and Elizabeth Smith noted that he was standing in the front garden when they pulled up. Not frantic, not emotional, just waiting. Inside the house, it was clear this was no suicide. Miss Ann's body was found across the bed, naked with devastating injuries to her head. The violence was overwhelming. Blood on the walls, on the ceiling, even on the furniture. There was no gun anywhere, no residue, no evidence of a firearm discharge. Everything pointed to one conclusion. She had been beaten to death. As the detectives processed the scene, Brian watched, expressionless. He asked no questions about his wife. Didn't seem curious about what the investigators were doing. The only thing he wanted to know was whether he was being considered a suspect. Officers noted fresh scratches on his arms. He claimed he hadn't noticed them. Couldn't explain how they got there, but the scratches told their own story, one of struggle and resistance. For investigators, the puzzle pieces were already falling into place. There was no sign of forced entry. No missing valuables. No intruder. Whoever killed Miss Ann had done it up close and had known exactly how to make it look like something else. The problem was, the weapon was missing. The detectives needed it to complete the story. And as they soon discovered, Brian had been one step ahead, at least for a while. When they began canvassing the neighborhood, one resident mentioned something odd. He'd seen Brian walking his dog that morning, but instead of following his usual route, he'd taken a detour down toward the drainage ditch near the end of the street. It struck the neighbor as unusual, especially because Brian seemed to be carrying something heavy in a plastic bag. Detectives pulled security footage from homes along Wake Forest Drive. What they saw changed the investigation entirely. At exactly 8:45 a.m., the cameras captured Brian walking the dog and stopping at the drainage ditch. He bent down, tossed something into the water, and walked back home. 25 minutes later, he called 911. When investigators searched the drainage ditch, they found two items: a rubber mallet smeared with blood and a cell phone smashed but not destroyed. The mallet would prove to be the murder weapon, the tool Brian used to bludgeon Miss Ann to death. The phone contained fragments of his communications, including messages linking him to his mistress in Florida. The truth was now visible, only waiting to be confirmed by forensics. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation performed the autopsy. The findings were brutal. Miss Ann had died from blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation. She had fought back. Evidence was found under her fingernails. DNA confirmed it belonged to Brian McManus. Those scratches on his arms? They were hers. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this, of manipulation, betrayal, and justice, remind us how fragile trust can be and how vital truth remains. By the time investigators confronted Brian with the evidence, the web of lies he'd built began to collapse. His story changed constantly, first insisting it was suicide, then suggesting it might have been a robbery. When that failed, he blamed others, including Miss Ann's own granddaughter and her boyfriend. Each new lie was colder than the last, but detectives stayed patient. They didn't argue. They simply presented the evidence: video footage, DNA results, timestamps, phone data. Piece by piece, his narrative fell apart. And as it did, a portrait of Brian McManus began to emerge, not just as a killer, but as a serial manipulator. A man who viewed women as tools for his convenience, obstacles to remove once they no longer served his purpose. Brian McManus had always believed he was smarter than everyone else. Smarter than his victims, smarter than the police, smarter than the world that had rejected him. For most of his life, arrogance had been his shield. But now, inside the Warner Robins Police Department, that confidence was beginning to crack. Detectives Carmen Thompson and Elizabeth Smith had seen his kind before. Men who lied effortlessly, men who mistook calmness for control. But this time, they had science on their side. The DNA, the video footage, the weapon, the timeline. Every thread of evidence wove the same story, Brian's story. And for the first time, he couldn't control the narrative. When questioned, Brian sat upright, arms folded, speaking in the same clipped professional tone he'd used as a former police officer. He told them that his wife was emotionally unstable, that she had been depressed, that she must have done this to herself. But when the detectives quietly slid a photo across the table, a still image from a neighbor's security camera showing him tossing something into a drainage ditch that morning, the facade faltered. He looked at the image for a long time, his face blank. Then he blinked and said, "That's not me." It was the same tactic he'd used his entire life. Deny, deflect, deny again. But the evidence didn't bend. It stood silent and absolute. When the search teams recovered the rubber mallet from the ditch, the lab confirmed it was covered in Miss Ann's blood and hair. On its handle, microscopic traces of Brian's skin cells remained, irrefutable proof of contact. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just suggest guilt, it defined it. The autopsy report deepened the horror. The blows to Miss Ann's head were not impulsive strikes. They were deliberate, repeated, and aimed to kill. The pathologist concluded that she had also been strangled by hand. It meant that even after the bludgeoning, Brian had chosen to finish what he started. And yet, even as the walls closed in, he didn't stop lying. When news of Miss Ann's death spread through Warner Robins, the community was shaken. Neighbors who had known her for years could barely speak of it without tears. To them, Miss Ann wasn't just a name in a headline. She was kindness personified. The idea that someone could do this to her, let alone her husband, seemed unimaginable. Jessica Terrell, her granddaughter, refused to believe it at first. She had seen Brian every day, eating dinner at the same table, sharing the same house. How could someone who smiled so easily, who acted so calm, be capable of something so monstrous? But the moment she learned about the text message, the one Miss Ann had received by mistake, everything made sense. Her grandmother had found out about the affair, and Brian had panicked. Jessica remembered the days before the murder. Miss Ann had seemed uneasy. She'd said she was tired, that she needed to have a serious talk with Brian after Thanksgiving. Jessica never imagined that talk would cost her grandmother her life. Investigators built their timeline with surgical precision. Every movement, every call, every text. Between 8 o'clock and 9 a.m. on the morning of November 24th, Brian's phone pinged repeatedly in a small radius around Wake Forest Drive. At 8:45, he was captured on camera walking toward the drainage ditch. At 8:53, he returned home. At 9:10, he dialed 911. There was no window for anyone else to have entered or left the property. The narrative he'd tried to craft, that of a distraught husband discovering a suicide, collapsed under the weight of evidence. Then came the DNA results. Blood beneath Miss Ann's fingernails matched Brian's profile. The scratches on his arms, once brushed off as nothing, were now proof of a struggle, her final, desperate attempt to fight back. As detectives compiled their findings, the district attorney, Eric Edwards Murr, reviewed the case file and saw what they all did. This was not just murder. This was premeditated. A killing born out of self-preservation, orchestrated to protect a lie. And that made it something far worse. A cold-blooded execution cloaked in civility. Brian McManus was arrested on November 25, 2023, less than 24 hours after Miss Ann's death. He was charged with malice murder. When officers placed the cuffs on his wrists, he didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "You've made a mistake." At the county jail, he told other inmates he was being, quote, framed. He said his wife had mental health problems, that the police had mishandled evidence. He even claimed that jealous relatives were trying to ruin him. But no one believed him. Behind bars, the charm that had carried him through life began to fade. The former police officer, once proud of his authority, now sat among criminals, stripped of every illusion of control. Months passed. The investigation deepened. Prosecutors gathered witness statements, text records, and Brian's long history of manipulation. They unearthed the story of his dismissal from the London Metropolitan Police, the sexual harassment complaints, the inappropriate advances toward female colleagues. They tracked down his ex-wife in Idaho, who described years of emotional abuse, threats, and violence. The pattern was undeniable. Brian McManus had spent decades exploiting women, deceiving them, using them, discarding them. Each time, he found new ways to justify his cruelty. But this time, his lies had ended in death. For Miss Ann's family, the wait for justice was agonizing. Jessica attended every hearing, holding back tears as she watched the man who had destroyed her grandmother's life sit emotionless in a courtroom. The sight of him, clean-shaven, calm, dressed in a crisp shirt, felt like an insult. He still carried himself like a man in control, but the truth, for once, was beyond his control. The trial began on July 7, 2025, in the Houston County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, family members, community members who had come to see the man once known as the British gentleman face the full truth of what he had done. Over 6 days, prosecutors presented an unbroken chain of evidence. They played the security footage showing Brian's walk to the drainage ditch. They displayed the blood-stained mallet. They presented the autopsy results, the DNA findings, the text messages, and his pattern of deceit. When they described how he'd tried to frame his own step-granddaughter and her boyfriend for the murder, gasps filled the room. It wasn't just desperation, it was cruelty. He had tried to turn a grieving family against itself. Throughout it all, Brian sat motionless. His face betrayed nothing. Some said he looked bored, others said defiant. But there was no hint of remorse. When Jessica Terrell took the stand, her voice trembled. She spoke about the woman her grandmother had been, quote, kind, loving, endlessly patient. "She was my best friend," Jessica told the court. "She didn't deserve any of this. She trusted him." She believed in him, and he used that trust to destroy her. The jury listened in silence. After 6 days of testimony and evidence, the case was handed over for deliberation. It took just 2 hours for the jury to reach a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. On July 16, 2025, Brian McManus stood before Judge Edward D. Lukemire for sentencing. The judge looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You basically bashed in the skull of another human being," he said. "A person who welcomed you into her life, her home, and her family." Then came the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian didn't react. No tears, no outburst, no visible sign that he had heard or understood. He simply stood, stone-faced, as deputies led him away. For Miss Ann's family, it wasn't victory, it was survival. Justice could never undo what he had done, but at least they knew he would never hurt anyone again. At the sentencing hearing, Jessica addressed the court one last time. Her words echoed through the room. "I can't tell her how sorry I am," she said, voice breaking. "I was supposed to have Thanksgiving lunch with her that day, but I didn't go. I thought I'd see her the next day. I thought I had time." She paused, holding back tears. "But I didn't. None of us did. She was taken from us, brutally, by someone we trusted." Another granddaughter spoke softly. "She was my beautiful, kind, and loving Mem. She was ripped away from us by a selfish, cold-blooded monster." The courtroom fell silent. Even seasoned reporters had tears in their eyes. When the trial ended, Warner Robins slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The decorations from that Thanksgiving had long been taken down. The garden at 202 Wake Forest Drive, once alive with Miss Ann's flowers, now stood still. Her chair on the porch remained empty, a haunting reminder of a life built on kindness, ended by cruelty. But her story continued to resonate, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a warning about trust, manipulation, and the predators who hide behind charm. District Attorney Eric Edwards described Brian McManus as an evil sociopath who viewed the women in his life as disposable. His words captured what everyone felt, that this case wasn't just about one woman's death, but about the dangers of exploitation disguised as love. Miss Ann had believed in the good in people. That belief, while beautiful, had also been her vulnerability. But her legacy, the love she gave, the family she built, would outlast the man who tried to destroy it. Because in the end, Brian McManus's story ends behind prison walls. But Miss Ann's story, of generosity, of resilience, of love, continues to live in the hearts of everyone she touched. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember Lucille, Miss Ann McManus, a woman whose kindness deserved so much more than the cruelty she met. And if you want to see more powerful true crime documentaries like this, subscribe to this channel, Unsolved True Crimes, UTC, and turn on notifications.